Well, good evening, everyone. It's 8 o'clock, and welcome to the January 2026 CCS lecture. I'm Jerry Zeeler, your CCS chairman, and the chair for tonight's talk by Dr. Rob Wheeler. Rob is, of course, well known to almost all of you, I'm sure, as the Honorary Secretary of the Charles Close Society, and brilliant historian and all-round good egg. And he's giving us a talk this evening entitled Bartholomew's Half-Inch of England and Wales, What the Plates Can Tell Us About the Maps and Vice Versa. Having realised the importance of patching, Rob started looking at the early history of the series and how the printed sheets relate to the plates. He believes that the results are instructive. He'll end by explaining how a country on one projection, Scotland, can be joined to one on another projection, England, or perhaps how it ought not to be done. Very intriguing.
I want to start by setting the context. There's a widespread view that in the 1890s, the Ordnance Survey was rather conservative, backward even, whilst Bartholomew's were innovative, forward-looking and technically capable. In fairness to the senior officers of the survey, they had been given a task by the government of producing a series of maps covering the country. That task would take several more years to complete. So far as the 1 inch was concerned, they saw their existing course as leading to the production of the best possible map. And a hacheured map was indeed the best possible way of showing relief if you were a military officer evaluating a position in terms of dead ground, or a geologist looking for signs of glacial moraines. The tourist might prefer something simpler, but they did not see their job as catering for tourists. John George Bartholomew, in contrast, was interested in making maps that people, lots of people, would want to buy. He wanted a polished product. So far as accuracy was concerned, it needed to be good enough for the purposes for which it was to be used. And he saw that colour could make the map more attractive and could also convey information more clearly. As for technical capability, his firm had good engravers. They had to be good too at deleting by the traditional processes like hammering out, because the firm had no ability to produce electrotypes, which was how the OS had done its copperplate deletion for several decades. The firm could produce transfers to stone by the process of patching up that I described in the last Sheetlines. This enabled them to combine information from different sources and was routinely used to supply margins. Their ability to do anything directly on the stone was severely limited. They could print colours from additional stones, but accurate registration was weak. For that reason, they liked their maps to have all the detail in black, with colour used to enhance. Thus, bodies of water have black edges and blue fill. Layers are applied in colour to black dotted contours. In contrast, the OS used zinc for its lithographic processes. Its capabilities included photozincography to make reductions, heliozincography to make a new plate from an ordinary printed impression, the production of blues as a base for drawing that would not photograph, and the Van Dyck process was coming in. In fact, the OS is a difficult subject when the cartographic historian has to rely on the maps themselves, just because they had so many ways of achieving a result. Bartholomew's is much easier because they had just a couple of techniques which they relied on heavily. The OS was criticised for not keeping its maps up to date. Various private mapmakers told the Dorrington Committee that this or that map ought to be regularly revised and be completely reissued every, say, 5 years. Next slide, please. Here we have an extract from an Environs of London sheet printed by Bartholomew in 1892 at the time the Dorrington Committee was hearing witnesses. It was regularly reprinted for W.H. Smith, so must have been a popular sheet. In fact, it's difficult to imagine a better selling area. For comparison, there is an 1860s Old Series 1-inch to its right. Quite clearly, it had been made from the old series, which had been replaced as the current map 20 years before. Railways have been kept up to date. The line to Wimbledon, top left, has been added rather inaccurately, having a right-angled junction with the main line. There is the occasional name which appears to have been updated from the new series, but otherwise the detail is ancient. In fact, we happen to know that the plate was engraved by J.W. Froggatt in 1833. Quite a lot of the commercial competitors were indeed extraordinarily bad. There was an aspect of Bartholomew's half-inch sheet 30, Surrey, which was puzzling me. This series, the whole series, was printed lithographically, but the detail plates were created by engraving on copper. And all these copper plates survive in the Bartholomew archive at NLS. So I asked Chris Fleet if he would examine the plate, hoping that this would answer my question. Next slide, please. On the left of the slide, you will see the plate storage, quite possibly little change since the plates were first engraved. I then found I needed to rethink my ideas about copper plates. On the right, we see the plate used for sheet 29, a little to the west of the area I was interested in. I have flipped the picture so that you don't need to read it in mirror image. At the bottom, you see Odium. To the north is the M3 with the hook exit. A motorway on a copper plate created in the 1890s? Yes, because these plates were regularly updated right up to the demise of the series in the 1970s. I had hoped that the plate might tell me something about the origin of the sheet, and I found that what it showed me was a modern half-inch such as I had used in my youth. Underneath, by the way, is an image of part of the reverse of a plate showing the hammering out used for deletions. The second shock came when Chris told me he couldn't find a plate claiming to show Surrey. He was afraid it might have gone astray. I had actually wanted information about the area covered by each plate, which I had thought might relate to an earlier set of sheet lines. Reading detail off copper plates isn't easy, especially in mirror image. And then I realized that the edges of plates corresponded to the edges of new series 1-inch sheets. In fact, the normal size for a plate covered a 3x3 block of new series sheets. And there were no overlaps, so we had a rigid grid of sheet lines, or rather of plate lines. Next slide, please. A 3x3 grid of OS small sheets covers an area 54 miles by 36. The standard Bart's half-inch covered 55 miles by 39, with a 1 mile overlap east-west and a more variable overlap north-south. So this grid is just the right size. In places, everything is tidy. Thus, the Oxford plate corresponds exactly to the Oxford map, barring overlaps. But in the southeast corner of the country, whilst the grid is economical in the use of copper, it produces unsaleable maps. Who wants a map of the Thames estuary with a portion of Essex, a portion of Kent, and a lot of water in between? At that point, John George Bartholomew's evidence to the Dorrington Committee is very relevant. Asked about the 2-year delay between completion of the survey and the publication of an engraved outline sheet, he claimed that if his firm was given the job, he could do it in a fortnight by dividing up the sheet between different engravers and printing from stone. He didn't actually use the words patching up, but if you have to assemble a sheet from multiple plates, that is the obvious way, although the OS still preferred to take electrotypes and rivet them together when it came to produce the large sheet series. The key point of this is that patching up means that your plates need bear no relationship to the maps you produce. Thus, when producing a Kent sheet for the half-inch series, Bartholomew could take his Thames Estuary plate, which went down as far as Dover, and his Beachy Head plate, which carried on to the south, and by using a somewhat non-standard sheet size, get the whole of the county, other than the London suburbs, onto a single sheet. The third shock was a matter of accounting. The Bartholomew archive contains cost and order books listing all their maps, along with the sums spent on preparatory work, on paper and ink, and on printing. I expected to find engraving listed here, and quite clearly it wasn't there. A separate engraving book, next slide please, lists very broadly what the engravers were doing. I say very broadly because they were booking their time to reduced ordnance England half-inch. No indication of what map it was for. But of course, if the plates don't correspond to the maps, the engravers may not know on what particular product their labours will first see the light of day. And that word first is very important. Engraving one of these plates probably cost at least £80. If that was charged to a single map, it would appear to make an enormous loss. So engraving, certainly projects like the half-inch, appears to have been regarded as a capital cost. It enters into the cost calculation via a markup of around 40%, which presumably covers overheads and perhaps all capital items. That markup equates to about £5 per 1,000 sheets. So it needs 16,000 impressions, even if the whole of that markup is devoted to engraving costs. But almost certainly that markup had to be shared between multiple expenses. Thus, it might require 30 to 50,000 impressions to make the engraving worthwhile. That is a sobering thought. The first mention of a half-inch reduced ordnance map for England comes from Tim Nicholson's 2000 article in the Cartographic Journal. In June 1886, John George Bartholomew told Edward Stanford, Jr., of his embryonic plans for a series and mentioned that he had engraved a few extracts, but as yet no full sheets. Stanford seems not to have been interested. But Bartholomew continued with engraving, as we see from the book here. Bartholomew at this date was primarily a map producer, distributing via other publishers, hence the approach to Stanford. I wanted to understand better the history of the England and Wales series, and the prime source of data was Eugene Burden's cartobibliography of early sheets, which you can find in Sheetlines 56, based on inspection by him of the Bartholomew print record. This gives the earliest sheets as Sussex and Kent in June and August 1891. Both sheets had fancy titles, Brighton and the Sussex Coast and Watering Places of Kent. I had developed some theories about why these first sheets had fancy titles, but I then discovered the titles already existed for quarter-inch sheets produced by Bartholomew and sold by W.H. Smith in their Travelling Maps series. They added these two half-inch sheets to their series alongside the existing quarter-inch and sold them at double the price, 2 shillings cloth rather than 1 shilling. Surrey was the third sheet listed by Eugene Burden, appearing in June 1892. I happened to be looking at the 1896 printing of this sheet at Cambridge, and I noticed references in the margin to adjoining sheets, something I had never seen before on a Bartholomew map. The bottom margin and the right-hand margin mentioned the Sussex and Kent sheets, respectively. But in the right-hand part of the top margin was a reference to environs of London. It seemed unlikely that the map referred to was the old series derivative, not least because this was printed specifically for W.H. Smith. Slide, please. Which enables you to see that it is indeed specifically for them. Searching the Bartholomew printing record is not easy because the listings are very cursory, and Environs of London is a widely used title. But I prevailed upon Chris Fleet to conduct a search, and slide, please. This is what he found. Printed in May 1891, it has to be the very first England and Wales Reduced Ordnance Survey half-inch produced by Bartholomew. It escaped inclusion in Eugene Burden's listing because he focused on the 37 numbered sheets, and this sheet never reached the numbered series. Now, this is not the layered half-inch we would later regard as standard, and there are some, like Tim Nicholson, who would regard it as something quite different. But it used the same copper plates, and as I was explaining, most of the cost of that map went into those plates. Layers to show altitude were not quite negligible, but were a much smaller proportion of the cost. Looking at the Kent and Surrey sheets, I had roundly declared that the plates and the maps were almost divorced from one another. Had I been aware of this map, I would have been much more cautious in my statements because it corresponds exactly to the London plate in that grid of plates I showed you earlier. No overlaps and no patching up except for the margins. Aesthetically, I regard this as a very pleasing map, fresh and clean and beautifully clear. Brown is used for main roads, green is used along with tree symbols for woods and without the tree symbols for parks. Blue, as usual, is water. A dove grey is used for vignetting to emphasise county boundaries. Wanting counties to stand out was something that characterised these maps right to the end of their lives. And then we have pink, used to emphasise built-up areas. So if you look at Watford, you will see that the High Street has this pink background. London, in contrast, has screened black for the densely built-up area, and then a less dense pink tint to the whole of the County of London. The pink plate was never quite satisfactory, but here at least it seems to work tolerably. So 6 colours in all, with 6 passes through the press. It wasn't a cheap map to produce, but then with the cost of engraving the plate, there was no point in skimping on other aspects. As a map for the tourist, it is more questionable. Next, please. The legend gives 2 categories of road, brown being main and white other. Actually, the engraver distinguishes wide and narrow white roads. The model used by the engraver was drawn from the OS New series, which in this area was about 20 years old, and was criticised in the Dorrington Committee for showing a lot of minor roads that no longer existed or were private. So Bartholomew's draftsman did not have an easy task. Actually, the OS engraver did make subtle distinctions so that the intelligent user could spot private carriage roads and streets laid out by a developer and distinguish these from roads which should at least be passable on foot. Bartholomew's draftsman seems to have been alert to some of these subtleties, but the category of narrow white roads embraces all these types without distinction. Thus, south of the M of Farnham, you have streets laid out in a development that came to nothing. And then you have sundry roads through Farnham Park, which was certainly private. There are also a lot of mere occupation roads, as well as perfectly usable public roads. On this extract, all the roads in the first and second classes were indeed usable, but elsewhere one can find even brown roads, which were so vestigial that the OS omitted them from the revised new series when it came out. Next slide, please. The most interesting bit of the legend is here. It is not quite explicitly stated, but the vertical interval for contours is 500 feet. Somewhat parsimonious. Indeed, in an area like this, pretty useless. The draftsman here tried to compensate by providing lots of spot heights, especially, but not solely on main roads. Note the round numbers. The ones I have underlined are not OS spot heights, but are taken from the OS contours, which is why they're round numbers. I said the draftsman here because the character of the map varies between different areas. Here, Edenbridge is given that pink background, but in the previous extract I showed you, Farnham was not distinguished in that way, and there were absolutely no spot heights of any sort on that extract. Sussex and Kent were similar to London. From Eugene Burden's list of reprints, we can say that sales of these were distinctly modest. Fortunately, a couple of special projects emerged. The first was the map of Surrey I mentioned earlier, showing the 6 constituencies into which it had been divided, next slide please, under the Redistribution of Seats Act 1885. This will have required almost no engraving. It used the greater part of the London plate and the north part of the Sussex plate, both of which already existed. Overprints provide constituency names and boundaries, along with tinting in pink of those constituencies lying within the ancient county of Surrey, but now within the county of London. Next, please. In fact, this pink is the pink tint for the county of London, which we had already seen on environs of London, but now limited to the Surrey portion. Constituencies in Surrey proper merely have their borders tinted. Look at Norbury Station. Running through the B of Norbury, you will see a boundary between 2 such constituencies. There is a thinnish red line. It doesn't need to be so prominent away from that pink tint. Beneath the red line is a dotted black boundary, like the county boundary. This was engraved on the plate. Bartholomew, as I was explaining, regarded registration errors as inevitable. Therefore, for anything where accuracy mattered, boundaries needed to be on the plate, with colour to enhance them if you liked, but colour would not show accurate position. So precise constituency boundaries matter in Surrey proper, but they don't matter in the County of London, where a red line by itself is good enough. The map was printed 6th of June 1892. Voting in the unexpected general election of that year was in July. This looks like a special order placed by the Surrey organisation of one of the main political parties to make sure the right candidates were being canvassed for in the right places. But it's not a rush job. It looks like a product that had been prepared in advance, ready for a print now order when Gladstone called the election. And precision matters, because if a boundary runs along the middle of a road, it's rather important for canvassers to get the constituency right, rather than urge electors to vote for a man who isn't standing in their constituency. There is one downside to engraving something like this on the plate. It's a lot of trouble to delete it, without, as you will remember, the option of using electrotypes. In fact, Bartholomew never got round to deleting those boundaries. The Surrey constituencies of 1892 were still shown on maps printed in the 1960s. Next slide, please. Here, if you look at the top right corner of the big extract, you will see Poyle House. A constituency boundary runs between that name and the edge of the extract, and then runs south in a zigzag east of Poyle House. The small extract is from a 1960s printing. There is a new name, Kingston. The dots are still there, running east-west, north of Kingston, and then zigzagging south to the east of Poyle House. I had another reason for using this extract. You will see that a small extrusion has been added west of Farnham so that the whole of Surrey is on the map. That extrusion has been engraved on the plate. There is no join from patching up. Almost certainly, the next plate to the west in 1892 had yet to be engraved. Doing an extrusion on the plate rather than as a patch can cause problems, as we shall see later on. The next development came at the other end of the country in Northumberland. The History of Northumberland Committee was about to launch the first two parts of its parish by parish history of the county. It wanted a map showing parishes and the townships into which they had been divided. I suspect a member of the committee was familiar with Bartholomew's reduced ordnance maps of Scotland. He may perhaps have taken the Dumfriesshire sheet with its tinted parishes and said, "We want something like this, but showing townships as well." Whereas the OS response to such approaches seems to have been, "What you really want is this." Bartholomew seems to have been happy to give customers like this what they wanted, as long as it didn't prevent him adjusting the plates later. So, slide please. Here is an extract from that History of Lincolnshire, History of Northumberland Committee, I hope. Have you got it in the History of Northumberland Committee?
That is the slide showing now. It froze just now, I'm afraid, but so we've only just shown it.
Right, but you've got Map to Accompany Volume 1 of A History of Northumberland showing boundaries of townships.
That's
Yes.
right.
Good.
Yes.
Good. So you will see that railways have reverted to ladder pattern, which they hadn't been using on the England and Wales series. And of course, it was easy enough to convert them to solid black subsequently. Parishes have black dotted boundaries and names, as on the Scottish maps. Townships and their boundaries are on a red plate. Each volume of the history carried a map large enough to show the parishes treated in that part and something of the surrounding area. And there would, in due course, be 15 parts. So it was an ideal candidate for a map, or rather 15 maps, to be produced by patching up from a plate or set of plates covering the whole county. Charges for those maps will have defrayed a useful proportion of the cost of engraving the two northernmost plates. The consequence was that within Northumberland, the half-inch series would continue to show the ancient ecclesiastical parishes right up to the 1970s. The next development came in East Anglia. Gerald, the Norfolk publisher, had for some time published local maps. Some of these were printed by Bartholomew, including one of Norfolk in 1891. In 1894, Bartholomew persuaded them to publish sheets of Essex and Suffolk based on the new reductions of the OS. Next slide, please. The principal change in specification is that rouletting is now used for parks. Note the way the county name for Cambridgeshire is arranged vertically within the neat line. I presume this was done by transfer direct to the stone. You really wouldn't want to engrave that on the plate. Because these were county maps, some deviation was necessary from the lines of the plates. Suffolk is patched up from 4 plates. Next, please. Here you see the east-west join. The main sign to look for is roads that did not quite align, so had to be repaired. I have added the yellow to guide the eye. It is the black you need to look at. And next slide, please. Here you see the north-south join. Because the southern few miles are on the Bedford and Ipswich plates, that needed to be put in as well. The left-hand image, again, is the map as printed. The right-hand image adds a yellow line along the join. If you look at Underwood Hall, you will see a rather nasty double bend. It's entirely fictional. The roads on the 2 plates didn't join, and they needed to be made to join. Further west, it looks as though whoever drew the model for the Cambridge plate was being particularly sparing in showing roads, given that 2 roads terminate at the join. Actually, the road through Westley Waterless is quite an important through route, so that is more likely to be a careless omission. It provides some evidence on a point which is otherwise difficult to address: how much of the Cambridge plate had been engraved at this date. You see, the Suffolk plate only requires the eastern fringe of the Cambridge plate to be engraved. So was that all that had been done, or for tidiness' sake, did the engravers do the whole of the plate? Had there been a substantial portion of Cambridgeshire engraved, I think that the nature of the Westley Waterless Road would have been apparent, and it would have been engraved through to the bottom edge of the plate. But with only a fringe engraved, it would be an isolated piece of road in the southwest corner, and it's easy to see how it could have been left off. To continue with the history of the series, in 1895, a new sheet, South Devon, was issued, and Surrey reappeared, or perhaps we should say appeared, since it's unclear whether the previous version was on public sale. These were the first maps in the English series with layer colouring. Preparing the tint stones cost a little under £2 for each map. Compared to the Gerald maps, there were now 6 printings rather than 4, adding about 2p per map to production costs. So it was not something to be done lightly, but it wasn't a major strategic decision like engraving the plates. The Surrey sheet will have needed minor changes to the plate, notably making the county boundaries dashed, but that would be fairly straightforward. And these 2 maps were marked in the book as being for publications department. In other words, the firm was marketing them itself. Meanwhile, the cycling craze was developing. The new bicyclists wanted maps showing heights clearly, and they seem to have liked these new maps. The following year, Kent and Sussex were reissued in this form. In 1897, more sheets appeared, and towards the end of the year, the sheets started to carry a number, an implicit declaration that complete coverage of England and Wales was intended. And they never looked back. One of the things I learned when investigating Bart's work for the War Office was how instructive it can be to see what happened at maps' east and west neat lines. Clearly, there is a difference between neat lines which are an arbitrary cut and neat lines which are the same for the map as for the plate from which it was produced. In the latter case, we are largely looking at how the neat line was treated by the engraver. And for quite a few of these sheets, the east neat line is indeed the edge of the plate. You might think that engravers would be really rather keen to avoid running names across the neat line. And if you look at, say, the Bedford and Hertford sheet, that seems to be confirmed. Slide, please. There are just 3 names that break the neat line. One is in, and if the name is to be positioned so that there is no doubt which building the inn is, the engraver really had no choice. For the second name, there is just too much other detail to allow the name to be moved left. The OS found this too. Their solution was to engrave Bedell's on one sheet and End on the sheet to the east, which is all very well if they're mounted together, but a bit perplexing for all the users who buy just one sheet or the other. The third name, likewise, there really is nowhere else satisfactory to put it. I then looked at a later sheet, Derby and Nottingham. Again, the east neat line was the east edge of the plate, but this time there were 12 names breaking the margin. A lot were insignificant place names that could have been omitted. A lot could have been fitted in elsewhere. The difference in number is substantial. So I looked at more examples. 3 further sheets where I knew the engraving had been done in or before 1897, 2 names, 5 names, and 5 names. I looked at 2 more sheets from after 1897, 16 names and 21 names. So what was going on? I need to introduce another piece of evidence. Next slide, please. Here we have an extract from that Suffolk sheet I showed you earlier. A hamlet, if indeed it qualifies as that, in the parish of Ousden. It is called Back Street, but it appears on the Gerald's map as Bark Street. The error had been corrected by 1903, as you see below. It would be interesting to know how the engraver managed to delete the serif at the top of the R, facilitating its conversion to a C. There's no sign of any hammering out on the back of this plate. But what matters here is how that error occurred. The name is perfectly clear on the OS map being reduced. Engravers do one letter at a time with enormous care. They are not liable to produce typos. So I believe the engraver really did misread the name. Remember, he will have been working from a model produced by a draftsman, and such names as the draftsman puts in need to indicate the style required. They need to be in the correct position and of the correct size, but they don't need to be polished lettering. So I suggest this one was just a little too unpolished. The engraver thought he knew what was wanted, and he got it wrong. So when I talked in the context of the Bedford and Hertford sheet about the engraver having little choice about names, I really meant that the draftsman producing the model had little choice. The engraver had no choice at all. His job was simply to follow the model. Now, I suggest, and for the moment, this is only a hypothesis, that when full production of plates for the England and Wales series got underway in 1897, there was pressure on resources, on draftsmen as well as engravers. And someone said, do we really need a model? Could the draftsman simply mark on the OS original those features that are not to be engraved? Because there had never been much in the way of proper generalization. Those features that were retained at the half-inch scale had generally been depicted exactly as they had been at the 1-inch scale. As far as names were concerned, the draftsman was now working directly from the OS 1-inch, and the standing instructions were probably in general to put the name where the OS had put it. But names can't be reduced in size by a factor of 2. So, relatively speaking, they take up more space and they are longer. Hence, a name that didn't break the margin on the OS sheet was liable to break the margin on the half-inch. And that is why one sees a big increase in names breaking the margin. I was wondering what evidence I might find to confirm this hypothesis, and I realized I had already noted things that were relevant. I had observed, for example, next slide please, that the quality of copying on the early sheets was not very good. Here we have the top of the Surrey sheet on the right. Sorry, at the top of the Surrey sheet on the where are we? Yes, the top of the Surrey sheet on the right, and the OS sheet from which it is derived on the left. Greenford Church is up near the top of the extracts. Follow the main road through Greenford heading north. On the OS, we have a junction to the right, almost opposite the church, and a V just beyond the church, with a minor road heading across a ford. This is, after all, rural Middlesex. Bartholomew omits both junctions and connects the two roads together east of the stream with no way of getting over it. Now change direction and head south through Greenford. A couple of 100 yards after the church, a road goes off left, i.e. east, with a right-hand bend shortly after the turn. Bartholomew shows this as a Y junction, although there is ample space to show it properly. All this is consistent with sloppy copying by the draftsman preparing the model. Before going on to the next slide, I can't resist a poke at John George Bartholomew's evidence to the Dorrington Committee. He explained that his maps showed the more useful through roads by a brown fill, the selection being based, if I recall correctly, on good information. Well, if you follow his brown road north from Southwell, you will see a minor road joining it at an angle from the right. That is the access road to Waxlow Farm. Beyond that access road, Bartholomew's brown road is actually private, as the OS indicates by not breaking the casing of the Waxlow Farm road and by not breaking the casing when it comes to a crossroads. But this is a subtlety which Bartholomew's draftsman seems not to understand. In fact, the revised new series was being surveyed at this time and shows this brown road, both north and south of the Waxlow Farm road, as merely a footpath. So much for the good information. Next, please. Anyway, on to our next example from a map that came out in 1901. Here the roads are copied accurately. There is one little problem of a different nature. Bartholomew shows a drain running through Branston Fen in an east-northeast direction. Beneath the F of Fen, it turns north, then resumes its previous direction, then veers northeast for half a mile, then turns sharp right and runs down to the through road, which Bartholomew shows quite reasonably with a broken brown fill. I have no criticism of the accuracy of the line. The problem is that it's not a drain. Everything I have described is shown on the 1-inch as a road of the most humble sort. I grant that the part immediately north of the through road did actually have a drain running alongside and is shown as such on the 6-inch, but it's not shown on the 1-inch, and that excuse does not apply to the remainder. I suspect that the engraver may have been working from a photographic reduction of the OS map and took the road to be a watercourse. But the main point I wanted to make is that so far as the line is concerned, the copying is very good. I could produce further examples showing that early maps have somewhat sloppy copying, whereas the post-1897 maps are much more precise. I regard this as confirming the hypothesis that for the early maps, the engravers were working from a manuscript model, for the later ones from a marked up OS sheet or a photographic reduction of it. This all came from looking at east edges. Before going on to look at west edges, I need to catch up with the history. Up to 1894, the half-inch of England and Wales had been without any serious depiction of relief. The standard print run was 2,000 copies, and sales were sluggish. I have seen a specimen of that 1891 London sheet, which seems to have been put into covers at the end of 1897 or early 1898. In May 1895, a new sheet, as I said, was introduced, South Devon, with layer colouring. There may have been a degree of nervousness about its applicability to England because the standard print run was reduced to 1,500, and the following month Surrey reappeared. It's easy to regard Surrey as an experiment. It was wholly duplicated by other sheets, so it could always be abandoned. The trouble is that the contours appear to have been engraved, and that meant the London and Sussex plates would be fully contoured thereafter, even if they were never layered. But the experiment proved a success. Both South Devon and Surrey needed reprinting by the autumn of the following year. Even if we assume that most sales occurred in the short summer season, so this period spanned 2 such seasons, it still looks as though sales were running at something like 700 per year, whereas the unlayered environs of London seems to have sold less than 300 per year. At any rate, Bartholomew seems to have been confident enough to press ahead. Kent and Sussex were reissued in this form, and a new North Devon sheet all appeared in the second half of 1896, with print runs back up to 2,000. And then, as I explained, from 1897, you start to see sheets with numbers and an index diagram implying an intention to cover the whole of England and Wales. From then on, sheets were issued as rapidly as the engravers could manage, the final sheets appearing in 1903. There was now a little problem. Surrey was popular. By 1900, it seems to have been selling around 3,000 copies per year. But the sheet as introduced duplicated the cover of London and Sussex. London and Sussex fitted the regular grid of sheets the firm appears to have aimed at. Next slide, please. But London had proved a dud in sales terms. Would a layered version be any better? Surrey's large overlap to the south meant that it covered the North Downs. Possibly that was one of the factors that rendered it popular. So withdrawing Surrey and substituting London in the interest of tidiness must have been rejected. What happened instead was that the column of sheets, including Surrey, was given rather mean overlaps to the north of Surrey, so that by the time one had reached Yorkshire, the sheets were lined up again. And London was abandoned. So let's get back to what happened at the west edges of plates. These, as you will see, are quite different. I had looked at the east edge of sheet 13, which was also the edge of the plate. There is an overlap with sheet 14 to its east, so if we look at the west edge of sheet 14, we are not looking at a plate edge, just an arbitrary north-south line drawn on the plate. So you might expect lots of names to be cut. In fact, there is just one name that breaks the neat line. Why the difference? Well, names are normally written to the right of the feature they depict. So if the name is cut, the feature is generally not on the map, so the part of it that appears can be deleted. Next slide, please. There is also the option of an extrusion, i.e. extending all detail into the margin rather than just breaking the neat line with a name. Here you see from sheet 13 on the left what they were faced with at Bottisford. Vale of Beaver in caps breaks the neat line and has to be deleted. Bottisford Junks could legitimately be deleted as the junction was outside the area of sheet 14, but the village name would have to be left. So why not have a little extrusion showing the whole village and saving the need to break the neat line with the village name? Include the railway junction, and that name doesn't need to be deleted. Beaver in caps still needs to go, and some tweaking of what detail is extruded avoids the inclusion of the two river names. Note the importance of the green tint plate in making the whole thing look tidy. The extrusion of detail occurs over quite an irregular area. Because of the green, that just isn't noticeable. Altogether, there are 5 extrusions on that sheet edge. 2 follow county boundaries to avoid anyone who wants the whole of Rutland or of Lincolnshire having to buy sheet 13. 2 are like Bottisford, and then there is Newark. Next slide, please. On the left, you see the town as it is on sheet 13. On the right is how it was treated on sheet 14. Given its importance as a centre for the surrounding area, it would have been unkind to have shown just the eastern outskirts and nothing more. Unfortunately, it was a troublesome extrusion because the name was placed to the west of the town, so the name had to be moved. And the obvious place to move it to was under the station name, space already occupied by the railway company name. So that had to move too. Moving names did literally mean a cut and paste job. So a little patch was made from the company name and pasted immediately right of the station. And if you look at the next slide, you will see it enlarged. And another patch was made of the town name and pasted underneath the station name. By way of proof, you may notice that the K of Newark on sheet 13 sits on top of the Great North Road. So a bit of road was transferred along with the name and wasn't deleted terribly well. You can see it above the left-hand serif and next to the lower diagonal stroke. And for that matter, there was a contour to the right of the company name, and that too got transferred with no real attempt at deletion. The final job of the litho writer was to restore the features that had been covered up by these patches. So the road east of Newark Station had to be redrawn, not terribly well, and the contours had to be repaired. That sheet is not abnormal. At least in this period, Bartholomew was quite relaxed about extrusions on the printed maps. Extrusions on plates were a different matter. I showed you earlier the extrusion on the early Surrey map. Next, please. Here it is in 1903. The county boundary has been changed to dashes, contours have been added. Sundry dubious roads have been deleted to reflect the revised new series, and Willey House with its park has been inserted where some of them were. It looks very different, but there's enough evidence to say that these are merely alterations to the old plate. We now have a plate to the west called Reading. What did that plate do? Should the detail of Surrey's extrusion be engraved anew, or should there be what I suppose we should call an intrusion, with this tiny bit of Surrey being left white? If we look at the map to the west, which of course has an overlap, it becomes apparent that some at least of the detail was indeed engraved a second time. So on the printed map shown on the right of the slide, we have 2 patches, and there is a certain amount of latitude about where the division between the 2 patches should fall. Grover's Farm is just cut by the Reading neat line, so needs to be on the right-hand patch. More seriously, Willey House is cut, and any deletion here will delete the rouletting of the parkland, which will be almost impossible to repair. So Willey House and its park need to be on the right-hand patch. I've shown the division between the patches in red on the right-hand extract. And now we run up against another problem. I've already observed in connection with this sheet that the accuracy of copying by the draftsman drawing the model for the engraver left something to be desired. In doing this extrusion, the draftsman seems to have been particularly lax. "It's only an extrusion," he may have said to himself. The consequence is that when you lay one patch over the other, the roads don't join up. In Suffolk, we found the litho writer introducing sharp double bends to join such roads. Here he simply seems to have thrown his hands in the air and walked away. I want to end, as I promised, by looking at how England was joined to Scotland. Just to remind you, England was drawn by the OS on a Cassini projection, Scotland on the Bonn projection using a different central meridian. Bartholomew was engraving reduced copies of the ordnance maps, so the same applies to his products. One consequence is that a Scottish map needs to be rotated clockwise by almost a degree to fit in with an English neighbour. That may be a nuisance, but it's no worse than the situation in England when county series maps of different meridians needed to be joined. What is worse about the Anglo-Scottish border, as Brian Adams observed, is that lines of latitude in the Bonn projection have a different radius of curvature from the corresponding line on the Cassini projection. So the maps won't join properly. When I was first looking at the plates, armed with their names and the knowledge that they normally covered a 3x3 block of new series sheets, I extended my diagram of plate lines up the east coast and found it all fitted beautifully. That is to say, the system provided for a regular set of plates extending right up to the border. Perhaps that was the original intention. If the salespeople want a map that straddles the border, you can always produce something by patching up. The trouble is that the Anglo-Scottish border is wiggly, not like the nice straight ones we see set out in Africa, and joining patches along a wiggly line is fiddly. Besides, it's rather a waste of copper to have large blank areas the other side of the border. So it was decided that there should be a unified system of plates. How do you do this for maps that will not join? The obvious starting point seemed to be that Scotland was already engraved on Bonn. England did not yet reach the border in engraving terms. So stop the English engraving at a convenient line short of the border, and the edges of complete new series sheets would appear to offer such a line. Now position this line to get the best possible agreement with the Scottish material. The area in between this zigzag line and the border can be drawn in a coordinated way with as much shining up, i.e. fudging, as necessary. That, at least, is the theory. I was particularly interested in how this worked out around Doddington. Next slide, please. Where the English plate, called Holy Island, has a joggle with the western neat line moving back by about a mile halfway up the plate. And can I have the next slide, please? Which shows the Holy Island plate with its joggle and the southeast corner of the Berwick plate, both plates being flipped so that you don't have to cope with mirror images. Next slide, please. Slide one over the other, and you will see that the two fit together. So the reason for the joggle is that the Berwick plate extends further east than the plate to its south, which is called the Cheviot. It's all very tidy until you look at how it came about. The problem seems to have been that the Scottish project jumped the gun. In 1894, they wanted detail on the Berwick plate to extend to the neat lines. The eastern edge of the map was determined by the need to include all of Berwick-on-Tweed, so quite a chunk of Northumberland was included. The coordinated model that the engravers ought to have been following seems not to have been produced, yet at least. So they seem to have extrapolated, and done so rather badly. Probably no one noticed. They didn't even need to worry about contours. They seem to have got away with assuming a 500-foot vertical interval in Northumberland, despite a finer interval having already been adopted for those parts of Northumberland needed for the county history. Then, in 1897, the English sheet 1 was produced, covering the north part of Northumberland. The plate was engraved on Cassini up to the central vertical of old series 110, which also serves to divide new series sheets 1 and 3 from 2 and 4. Next slide, please. Sorry. The grey line on the extract to the left shows that zigzag line within the Holy Island plate. It runs up that central vertical as far as Ancroft, further north than the joggle I showed you before. It then steps east a couple of miles and runs north again, leaving the Berwick plate with as much as it needs of Berwick-on-Tweed, including quite a lot of the submarine contours. The area west of this should have been where this model provided a coordinated fudge, but the Berwick plate had already been engraved, and it disagreed fairly massively with the new English plate. Basically, they didn't join at that line. So there was a band of severe adjustment which extended both sides of the plate join, the grey line, in other words. I have marked with black dots the features on the Berwick plate that needed to be re-engraved. And those alterations are fairly brutal. So just south of Ancroft, a couple of roads join the north-south main road from about Berrington Law. They are aligned more or less east-west, as you see them on the 1894 map, or for that matter if you look at the modern OS. But they've been re-engraved to run almost northeast-southwest. And that is how they were published on sheet 1 in order to get them to fit. One secondary effect concerned contours, which had now been added more fully. If you're going to distort the detail, you really need to distort the relief in sympathy, which they did. The next development came in 1899 when a new printing of the Berwick map was needed. The normal procedure was that the part west of the grey line would be patched from the Berwick plate, the part east from Holy Island. The join might be a bit fiddly, but not unmanageable. However, the 1894 printing had been done solely from the Berwick plate. The new printing extended no further east, and whoever was managing the programme reckoned they should do the 1899 printing from the Berwick plate as well. The problem was that the adjustments had affected detail both sides of the grey line. So detail on the Berwick plate west of the grey line had been shifted, and it no longer joined up to detail on the portion of the Berwick plate east of the grey line. And the Berwick plate west of the grey line couldn't be touched because it had to continue to match the Holy Island plate. Hence, a series of fudges east of the line were needed so that the displaced detail could match the residue of the Berwick plate. Next slide, please. These changes weren't done very well. In particular, the main road past Barmore Castle was taken to a junction with the north-south road, which wholly misdescribes the nature of the staggered junction. The extract on the left here shows the 1899 printing. Note the contours. The fine ones are on the plate, the coarser ones have been drawn on the stone, and the layer tints have been made to agree with the latter, which is why you've got two lots of contours that don't quite agree. The outcome was that in this little area of Northumberland, we have two plates being used in parallel, the Berwick plate for the Scottish map and the Holy Island plate for the England one, and they both have their distinctive errors. Thus, on the right, we have the 1903 printing of the Scottish sheet. The road categories have been updated to reflect the revised new series, but the distortion is still there, being just too difficult to change. The contours have been nicely engraved and may well be positioned correctly in absolute terms, but they no longer match the detail. So we have a stream flowing across Barmore that starts below the 300-foot contour and rises to a height of something like 370 feet before descending again. Continuing this account of the two sheets blow by blow would be unprofitable and would extend this talk unduly. Suffice it to say that it seems to have been tidied up in the late 1920s or early 1930s, and perhaps that is when the Berwick and Holy Island plates were cut back to their present non-overlapping bounds. Thus, the Doddington joggle that motivated this is a relatively modern phenomenon. The lesson, such as it is, from the joining of Scotland and England is that if you're drawing a map, you really do need a reliable set of controls points to hang it on. Extending detail without them creates all sorts of future problems.
I'd like to invite now people far more eloquent than I can be to ask Rob any questions you might like. And let me see if I can get this screen back to our usual gallery.
You were commenting on the amount of research that went into it. I have to say just how much assistance I had from Chris Fleet, who was very good at delving to try and answer my obscure questions.
Well, praise indeed. I mean, well, we all know Chris's fame goes before him, doesn't it? What he's done at NLS is just purely remarkable. But with a lot of cooperation, I think, and enthusiasm from CCS. So well done, people like you, Rob, in the society who have liaised with Chris. But yes, he's a masterpiece, isn't he? The irony is he's English and sitting in Edinburgh. Right, folks, if you'd like to raise an electronic hand, because there's so many of us, it'll put you right in front of me and I can see that you want to ask Rob a question, so go for it. Richard Oliver has raised a hand. Richard, take it away. Don't forget to unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So it's a most remarkable talk, and it takes study of the Bartholomew map to a new level. And I hope that it will appear in Sheetlines in due course. There's one comment about what exactly the first layered map of England and Wales was, and it does seem to have been, as I understand it from Tim Nicholson's article in the Cartographic Journal back in year 2000, to have been the South Devon map of 1894, which rather exasperatingly there is no copy of in the Bartholomew printing record. So sorry. So if South Devon is Opus 1, Surrey is actually Opus 2 and only appears the following year.
Yes, I thought I said. Did I not say that, or did I?
It suggested that both streets appeared in 1895.
Ah, right.
Mm. Whereas the Devon sheet it does seem to have priority in 1894. It is of some interest in it has a note on it saying that because the OS don't map the contours around Plymouth, they've had to be conjectured.
Mm.
Mm.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your assistance with some of this research.
Thank you for the point, Richard, and Rob's answer, of course. Stephen at Sabre has got his hand up. I know you've got something to plug, haven't you, this Wednesday?
I do, yes. But this is actually more relevant to the tonight's questions. Rob, obviously, we've spent, as you know, we look at doing a lot of georeferencing of old maps, and we've looked at doing things with Bartholomew's half-inch, and we've found many problems with doing so. Now, obviously, you mentioned there that they're based upon the new series, so they're Cassini based on Delamere for England and Wales, at least. When we try and calculate the sheet edges using distance from Delamere with all the clever maths that's in place, we find that the edges of the sheets are actually slightly askew to Delamere. Is that something that you're aware of, or is it us not being able to calculate?
There is one phenomenon that goes on in Scotland where some of the maps get rotated, and I think Northumberland gets rotated as well, if I recall correctly. But I was not aware of other small variations, and I'm really a bit puzzled because insofar as the neat line of a map corresponds to the edge of the plate, the edge of the plate is tied absolutely rigidly to the new series and hence to Delamere.
Yes, I mean, to be honest, we've been talking to Chris, much like yourself, about it and trying to work out exactly how, because it just didn't seem to fit with Delamere. I mean, speaking to Richard as well, that was our best guess at the time, and yet the maths doesn't seem to work. And I suspect, you've mentioned that it's the edges are effectively arbitrary. And I'm wondering if it's something to do with those edges. So is anywhere that you're aware of that sheetline data in terms of distance from the origin available anywhere?
I'm not aware of anything. Chris Fleet did a certain amount of mapping of sheet lines, but I don't think that's the sort of accuracy that you are looking for.
Yeah, I mean,
Richard may know something. No? Hand is still up.
Yes. I'm wondering if part of the problem is that the published Bartholomew sheets we're familiar with don't have stable sheet lines. Certainly I've noticed with sheets 10 and 14 Lincolnshire is that the overlap between them varies, certainly on pre-1914 printing somewhat. And I'm wondering if there was a certain amount of distortion in taking transfers from the copper and laying them down on stone, and that as you're working from the stone, whether you're picking up certain distortions there. I appreciate this is not a very easy question to add, and it may depend what edition of Bartholomew sheet you're doing. You might discover that the only way to do it is to georeference every single sheet separately, and you can't simply do it as you would georeference the 1-inch news series by taking one lot of sheet corners and assuming that's going to apply to all the other versions. You just got to the whole blinking lot from scratch.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's how we've done Populars, for example, is knowing the sheet edges and just and calculating everything from there. Because unfortunately our tool sets work in miles rather than in feet, so we've had to do lots of 5,280 or whatever it is. calculations there. But yes, it's just really odd that they're noticeably skew. And if you try and georeference them mathematically, they don't work. I just wondered if you got any details about how those edges were created, and whether there is likely to be some skewing going on.
All I would observe, this is relevant to Richard's comment, is that when you are looking at an edge which is overlap, which is effectively an arbitrary line as opposed to the edge of a plate, then that will have been redone each time the map was reprinted with a different patch. And even when they were trying to make the patch more or less the same, it's never quite the same.
Yes.
So there is that complication. But you do seem to be talking about something more fundamental that I don't quite understand.
Yeah, we're talking hundreds of feet out from corner to corner. But yeah, certainly, if anyone's, I don't want to take up everyone's time with this, but certainly it's something that, I can certainly give far more detail about at another time that's more appropriate, perhaps. But it's just something that strikes us as being challenging.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Rob and Richard, for your helpful answers. Anyone else for the asking? Your final opportunity coming up here, because it's gone 9 o'clock, of course. Time for bed. Some hope. And any more questions for Rob Wheeler, please? Going, gone. It only remains for me to thank Rob for this masterwork of research. I don't care what he says. It's a brilliant thing. Here comes lots more applause floating through the ether. Huge hands there. Gosh, exploding hands. Well done, Rob. It's very good. And a fitting showdown for all of that. I hope those technical gizmos, it absolutely froze solid into the presentation of the slides. I don't know why. It just suddenly took off again. But not much damage was done, I hope, thanks to your skillful information delivery. So thank you very much. I'm going to wish everyone a happy week. Maybe see you at Sabre on Wednesday. And Rob, thanks once again. And until we meet again, folks, good night.